Well, start briefly. My name's Dale Maharidge. I came to the Bee November 17th, 1980. Remember the date? And I left, but it's funny, I cannot tell you the date I left. It was 1991 in March. So I was there for almost 11 years. I'll tell the rest of that story in a minute. You introduce yourself, Hilary.
Oh, I'm Hilary Abramson, and I came to the Bee in 1980, and unlike Dale, I don't remember the month. I didn't look it up. And I left in 1989.
Wow. So I came from Cleveland, Ohio. I was a freelance writer in Cleveland, and I wanted to be in California. And this is the context of what the Bee was like in 1980. Actually, it was 1979. I called the editor. I was like 22 years old, and this guy gets on the phone and spends almost 40 minutes with me, telling me what the Bee, how great they are, and let me know when you're coming out here. And at the end, I said, I missed your name. It was Frank McCullough, the great Frank McCullough,
Uncle Frank,
who David Halberstam called civilized macho in The Powers That Be. I'm like, oh my God, that's the kind of guy he was. So I had a Datsun pickup truck. And in August 1980, I drove west with my belongings in it, and I came to the Bee and applied. And the city editor was Bob Forsyth, bless him, rest in peace, Bob. He interviewed me, he looked at my clips. He said, I want you to write a critique of the two newspapers, the Sacramento Union, which I'm sure you had a story in, Hilary, and the Sacramento Bee. Write a critique of the metro sections. So I went out to Folsom Lake and camped, and on my typewriter in my lap, I typed out a critique of the papers. And I was very critical of the Bee and the Union both. The Bee failed. The Union kicked our ass on some stories. And so I came back and he read it and he said, see that stack over there? There was a stack as tall as Hilary of papers and files. That's the 400 people who want to work here. I want to hire you. But there's no jobs now. So call me every week, Dale. There were none of these, no cell phones back in those days. And so I called Bob every week. For 3 months, I lived out of my truck. And then finally...
This will never happen again.
Never happen again.
In America.
I was offered a job somewhere else. I won't go into that story. And he said, hold off on it. I'm going to know by Wednesday, day after the election, what's going on here. I don't screw yourself, because I may not have an opening. So it was Ronald Reagan was elected president. It was Wednesday. I called Bob, and he says, I got good news and I got bad news. I says, what's the bad news? He says, well, Reagan's president. He says, good news, you're hired. And I'm thinking, not the police beat, I fucking hate cops, because I was a police reporter in Cleveland. And he says, police beat. I said, great. And he told me, I replaced, I won't use the fellow's name. He'd been there for 17 years, and he had a police ID, not a press pass. And he says, I want you to go down there, kick ass, and go for the throat. Exact quote, Bob. And I was on the police beat for over a year. And anyway, it was, that they would hire a kid living out of his truck. That's what the Bee was like. It was a very different place a few years later.
Who did not have a master's degree in journalism.
I have a degree in anything. I had no college degree.
To put it mildly, never happen again.
So
Only
to you
one
now,
Dale Maharidge.
How did you get there?
Only one Dale Maharidge. Okay, so to show you the difference, Jersey girl, I drove west in my Nancy Drew Impala convertible. And I lived at the Men's Y in San Francisco because you couldn't meet Black Panthers at the Women's Y. And I had 40 interviews, hitchhiking, all this stuff. And again, it was 1970, and there were no women in newsrooms on the whole. And of course, I didn't, and I had no, I worked in book publishing and magazine publishing in New York for 2.5 years after college, but I didn't have any newspaper experience, although being co-editor-in-chief of the high school paper in college didn't work. Okay. Woodland, California, Yolo County, which my family called Yoho County, which shows you New York mentality. Ken Leake, family-owned, small daily. I sent everything. He called me. I remember sitting cross-legged in the Y on the bed. I was like 4 days to promising my father I'd come back. I'd been there a month. Promising I'd come back if I didn't get a newspaper job. And he said, come on up. So I took a bus, and he asked me how much I'm worth. When I said, what do you pay? And I said, you couldn't afford it, you know. And he hired me. And at one time, we had an entire woman staff. It was an amazing, small, family-owned paper. And, we'd sleep on our desks, with our heads on our desks, listening to the printing press going and the AP wire, UPI wire spitting out heaven on earth. Okay. So I was there 2.5 years. I made very little. There were no benefits. I would have paid him because Yolo County, I wrote about a crooked justice court judge who was a slumlord, took my own photos, did everything. DQ, so-called university, the first Indian Native American place of higher learning, all tax dollars. And I was, although it was unpolitically correct, I was able to out the people who ran it, many of whom were pilfering federal dollars. And then, of course, 5 beats photography, 7 days a week, probably 100 hours a week. I don't know. It was just everything that I could have wished for. And one day the phone rang, and it was the managing editor of Sacramento Union, Bob Carney, whom I actually saw last week. He offered me a job. And went from no money to speak of, making fair wages, God bless the Newspaper Guild, benefits, and thus began just a privileged career in Sacramento at both papers, almost 10 years, 8.5 really at the Union. I just want to say at the Union, I'm going to use a crib sheet, did a series. We did a lot of stuff for the first time that today is coming back, like wrote about architectural barriers. No one in California, no one had really written about it. So I lived in a wheelchair for a week or two, trained by the head of the State Department of Rehab, who was in a wheelchair, and went around Sacramento and showed how it wasn't built for people who were not able-bodied at all. It was ahead of its time. We did a lot of stuff like that, and did a series on aging in America, really, but went in undercover, which they wouldn't allow today, as a nursing home aide, and had to tie people in chairs and they still do it. And it did lead to some reform at the legislature. It hasn't changed oversight of nursing homes, tragically, but we wanted to change the world. And then we did an Under the Dome series about criminal behavior at the legislature, and all kinds. They started a Sunday magazine, and I did the first profile of Jerry Brown when he became governor, first time. And we actually, a male colleague and I posed as a married couple, and we did Swinging in Sacramento. We did Suburbia. We tried to blow the lid off the self-righteous belief of many people that, I don't know, this town was white, Christian, and just went to church. Anyway, and of course, our right-wing owner, the head of the San Diego Union, almost had a heart attack. And so anyway, one day the phone rang, and it was my buddy. I'd worked with Bob Forsyth at the Union for many years. Many of our colleagues by 1980 had started to go over to the Bee. And things were not as good at the Union without going into that history. And he was city editor. And so we talked about my going over there because I'd have the ability to do long-range projects. They had the money to spend to not have to do beats and long-range projects kind of on your own time. Are we current now? So I'll let that. Now we'll go into the Bee. You go.
So I get to the Bee, and there's a foursome of desks, and you sat cattywampus. Fiza Aline was here.
Right? Wasn't I on your left?
Yeah. No, you were. Well, we basically it was.
You
the
were
same
on my left.
It doesn't matter. But in those days, you could smoke in the newsroom, and somebody smoked cigars near me. Little tiny cigars. What were they called?
Thin French cigars. Very elegant, very sexy.
Yeah. How many cigars? I never bought them. I cribbed so many cigars. I owe you some money for cigars.
You do. They came in a very fancy case. The Tower Tobacco place sold them.
Yes. Yeah. And so it was a very the camaraderie of the newsroom at that time. Now, all newsrooms have tensions. That was a given, but it was a very pie sharing kind of place. We helped each other. This is the good stuff of the Bee. I was encouraged by Bob to really go after the police. I did some story. I did a story on police were using hollow point bullets. Now, back in Cleveland, where I was reporting, they're against the law. Hollow point bullets go in this big and come out this big. They're meant to maim and kill. And I saw them and I thought, the heck? So it led to a story on the Western thing. Western police departments were using hollow point bullets, and Eastern ones weren't. Response time. I developed sources in the sheriff's and police department. Terrible response times, and they were keeping it secret. I exposed that. Great support from Bob on that. The other thing that was about the Bee early on. So Bob was dethroned, but the paper had a social conscience, and it still does. I speak present tense. It was founded as a social reform paper. It against the hydraulic mining. The original McClatchy's up in the mountains. That carried through to the day I came there. You want to do a story on homeless people, powerless people. You were encouraged to do it. It was nurtured. The first story I did with the photographer Michael Williamson was on the detox center. They still called them winos then, and the headline even used the term winos. I would never use it today, but I was fascinated by these people. And we spent, in 1981, we did a deep dive into the center, spent days there, which led to then Bill Moore became city editor. He was a very interesting fellow. He wrote for Rolling Stone, and he had a very literary view of what journalism should be. And I never forget, I was in the restroom and he came in, I was going out, and he said, I want you to go ride the rails. What do you mean, Bob? Bill, what do you mean? Yeah, I was just down at there was a bar on 19th Street. I'll think of it in a minute, where all the hobos hang out. And he says, these hobos are complaining. There's all these new hobos out there. Go ride the rails and find out. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I called Michael Williamson and I said, we're going to do a story on the hobos and this and that. And Michael's over the moon. And then I said, well, you have to get a backpack. What do you mean? We're going to ride the trains. And he's like, oh my gosh. Wow. So we basically, about a week later, we jumped on a freight train out of Sacramento, went up to Klamath Falls, Oregon, came down to Fresno, came back, and what we saw was mind-blowing. All these people who had never been hobos before, just like the 1930s, who were riding the rails looking for work. A lot of them were from back east, and that was played on the front page. It got a lot of attention. It was reprinted. Players picked it up and so forth. It won awards. That led to our first book. The Bee was three books came out of the Sacramento Bee, and my first book was Journey to Nowhere, and it started with that freight riding trip out of the Sacramento rail yard, assignment for Bill Moore for the Bee. So it was a legendary storied place in that sense, and very good for me. The book came out, jumping forward, in 1985. It got pretty wide attention. Years later, it was reissued, and then Bruce Springsteen wrote the song Youngstown based on that book. So that was it all from the Bee, that whole process of stuff. You had some big stories. You did everything from interview Rush Limbaugh before anybody knew who he was to, God, what didn't you do?
Whereas we always said about the Sacramento Union, it was the most fun you could have with your clothes on. It was like page one. It was the old, there was a sports editor who had a bottle of whiskey in the drawer. I mean, it was really the real deal of that. And we were Avis. The Bee was Hertz. The Bee was the old lady. It did these long, historically accurate, went on, you had to wait a month, to see it, and we would go for the scoop and kill it. And we just kicked ass. We were young and on fire and crazy. I wanted to finish that there, the East Area Rapist, I did want to catch him, but we did seminal stuff and beat the pants.
The Golden State Killer, which everybody knows about today. You were reporting on it before anybody knew who he was.
We kicked the pants out of the Bee because they did the definitive, but I'm proud to say we really covered the main things. And then Gerald Gallegos, another serial killer who was an obsession. We went day and night on. But okay, the Bee. So here we are. It hurts, and I must say, it had the money to pay us to spend. I mean, I spent months on series, which we didn't have the leisure at the union unless, you did it on your own time a lot. And so there were a series of things that you talk about the cops. I did the first piece, I think, on the stun gun. I didn't know what a stun gun was. Nobody did. Nobody knew the cops were using it, and found out they were misusing it too. And we're talking about the early 80s, and today we're talking about the cops doing things wrong. We did that, and when 9/11 went in the mid 80s in Sacramento, it was
911. You mean?
No, it's
okay.
See, I'm not talking about. Yeah, we're not talking about the towers. You're right. 911 was not always with us in this country. In case young people are watching this and didn't know, and when that system went in for emergency, it was a wreck, and I mean, people died waiting for cops to come. And so I did an expose on it, and I remember the sheriff and chief of police, came into Mau Mau.
Jack Kearns?
Jack Kearns and, the sheriff.
Who just passed away last week.
I know. God, you keep up on.
I keep up on my Sacramento.
River City, baby.
Yeah.
And so did an expose on that, and they came into Mau Mau, but it was very factual, and we had the sources, we had it all pinned down, lawyered. And that was, Then I did a thing on the poorhouse. Sacramento County was wanting to force anyone on welfare to live in like a poorhouse. I mean, I nicknamed it the poorhouse. And it went up to the state Supreme Court, which found it unconstitutional. That was kind of a good thing. Did a long months on hate groups in California. I mean,
I remember that.
And I remember someone from the KKK on the phone first, saying, "Are you, and having to just, didn't hear it, just kept going. But that was a first. Well, anyway, the series was a first. And then did a long series. I did a long series on blacks in Sacramento. Mm-hmm. And that's where I learned that there were black cowboys. I never knew there were black cowboys. I mean, Jersey girl, here in California, who the heck sat down and talked about black cowboys? And so continued the, kind of taken from, the Washington Post kind of started using magazine style in features. I had started that at the Union, and then I was privileged to explode it at the Bee and do, takeouts on news features that would be on the front page about, there was a town that was dying, and I'll always remember that one. And we did the Sunday magazine started, and then I did cover stories, and then I was on the Sunday magazine for quite a few years. We did date rape, we did adoptees. Looking for birth parents, and there was no DNA. There was no 23andMe.
Right.
And so no ancestry. And then lived with a family where an 11-year-old kid, Danny McClendon, I don't remember anything, but I remember Danny McClendon, was on a sidewalk in his sneakers in suburbia. And I think it was Citrus Heights. And a drunk driver, early in the morning, came on the sidewalk, chills, and knocked his life out of him. And he was almost beyond rehabilitation of walking, but for almost over a year, I kind of lived with the family and saw that through.
Well, see, that's the Bee. The Bee was very much into that kind of story. They encouraged it. They also supported you, and I'll tell you a few C.K. Mokachi stories.
Oh.
So I, because Bob had told me to go after the cops, do some real journalism, they were not happy with me. And they investigated me. And they found out. I don't know if I told you this. I don't know. I did a story back in Cleveland. There was a fellow arrested for burning an American flag in protest of some political action. They came to his house a day later, in the middle, or a night later, 2 days later, smashed in his door and arrested him for burning the American flag. And I did an op-ed for the Cleveland Plain Dealer saying, you know, it's not a sacred piece of cloth. You know, this is the first of all. Oh my gosh, this sports editor walked out. I was screamed at when I went in the newsroom. Anyway, somebody found this story and sent it to CK.
I don't know that
to
story.
out me as like some kind of un-American, undeserving of
long hair.
And so CK came up to me and he said, you know, he told me what happened. He says, a little overwritten, but good story. He was amazing.
One thing you brought up earlier, I wanted to say, I know people who called CK and he picked up his own phone.
He picked up his own phone.
And in those days, that was unheard of. In those days, no publisher, they don't pick up their own phone. And people who would just walk in and say, is CK available? And if he were, he would see you if he didn't know you. And that was unheard of.
One day I was in the lunch line at the Bee cafeteria and I looked behind me and there's CK. He says, you want to have lunch? Yeah. And so here I'm sitting with the publisher of the paper and we're talking about music, I think. I mean, it was crazy. And he always had holes in his sweater.
I was just going to say, his powder blue cashmere sweater with the real leather patches.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't one of these faux things that Ralph Lauren
But it had holes in it.
Had holes in it. And drove in old cars, I recall. So I did a story on a young woman who was raped, and the police in like 3 counties. She ended up in Yolo County, Sacramento County, and it might have been the county next to Yolo. It might have just been Sacramento and Yolo.
And it was a brutal rape with really brutal details.
Absolutely horrendous. And the cops in not 1, but 2 counties, they didn't answer, they didn't respond, they didn't help her. She was all alone, and she was truly a broken person, a young woman. And so I did this story. And because to me, it was not unusual. You were writing about a horrendous, violent attack. I put in all the details of what they did to her. And it was controversial with Bill Moore, city editor, and Mort Saltzman, managing editor. He might not have been managing. He was projects editor.
Projects editor.
And then Diane Alters, who also worked on projects as an editor. The 3 of them, I mean, we had the lawyers in on it, and I didn't understand the big deal. And I fought like hell because some people said there shouldn't be details.
It's a family newspaper, ergo,
here we go.
You should not have this graphic. And your argument, as I recall vividly, was this was horrific crime, should not be sanitized. It should be shown for what it is. It's not
sexual.
It's not sexual. It was violent.
Saying rape isn't like nothing like a date rape, nothing thing where it wasn't brutal. This was, I mean, he almost murdered her. And so anyway, it went all the way up. CK was not, I think nobody ran it by CK.
McClatchy,
CK McClatchy, thank you, the publisher, executive
owner,
the top guy. The lawyer had looked at it, but bottom line, he was not thrilled. And all hell broke loose. And the head of every police, everybody was in there. In the end, it was factual. So it stood. A lot of readers canceled. They didn't want to read details of a violent rape.
And I remember CK.
That was the downside. Other than that, CK was phenomenal.
I think I recall CK saying he wasn't opposed to running the story, just not above the fold on the front page.
Oh.
That was the... By the mid-'80s, things started changing. They started corporatizing the newsroom. I guess they had visions of going broader, and so it got more corporate. The thing called MBO, remember MBO, Management by Objective?
Oh my God.
You gotta go have PTSD. I want to preface what we're going to talk about now by saying the Bee was a great place, but it wasn't a perfect place.
There is no perfect.
There is no perfect place. And what we're going to talk about now is the dark side, and it's not It's just factual. We have a bit of PTSD. We were talking about this before we came in here about some of the things that happened. The mind, and it was all done in that corporatization period. And it was one of the reasons I was ready to leave anyway, but I was ready to leave by the late 80s. I stayed till 1991. I didn't like what was happening. And they brought in, and I'll go there, they brought Gregory Favre in, who was part of that change. And if you were one of the golden ones, and I was one of those for about a year, you could do anything. But if you fell out of favor, you were under the belly of a snake.
Was it only a year?
About a year. No, but because by the 85 it was over. He had new toys.
He hired, well-known reporters who had Pulitzers from other newspapers to build the cachet and experience of reporters who didn't, just work in Sacramento.
Yeah. So I did a project with Michael S. Williamson, Escape from El Salvador. And we went, I heard about refugees coming from El Salvador, the war in El Salvador, which, to a little back history, was basically a very right-wing government. There was a leftist guerrilla insurgency. We were supporting the right-wing government. There was death squads. If you were a doctor treating refugees, you were considered a leftist and you were marked for death. And so I decided, let's go there. And so I was on the favorite list at that point. So Michael Williamson and I bought a one-way ticket to El Salvador, and we came back by bus, by river, walking, at one point in a dugout canoe for 2 months with refugees. And it was a hairy project.
Chills.
And the family we were smuggled, there was a family, the last family we smuggled, we went along with the Underground Railroad. And this crazy thing happened. We get to Mexico City with the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad religious person gets sick. Found out later he was a U.S. government informant, and he vanishes. So here we are with a family with a 2-year-old toddler and a vehicle, and there's roadblocks north of, we actually flew into Guadalajara at that point. There's roadblocks, and we're on our own. And what do we do? And so I'm freaking out. I called Gregory that day and I said, we're in a jam. We need help. He basically said, I don't have time for this. You figure it out. And he hung up on me. Now, I was 25 and Michael was 24 then. You don't do that. Now that I've been a teacher a professor for 30 years, I would never do that to a 25-year-old kid. And we were on our own. So Michael and I, one time we had 2 times, we almost had a fist fight. And then we said, let's stop this. And I basically said, we'll smuggle the family. It was a moral decision. It wasn't a journalism decision. It was a moral decision. So there was a roadblock, and every woman who got caught at the roadblocks was raped. Every man was beaten. This was very high stakes, hairy stuff. We drove. I got a map book out, and I drove into the Sierra Madre, where they showed there were roads. There were no roads. We ended up going across the desert for hours, just following the edge of the mountains. Came to a hacienda. They hadn't seen anybody from the outside in 6 months. They fed us. They pointed us the right way. We got to Nogales, to the border. Sidebar, that 2-year-old we smuggled, I did a piece for the New York Times. She was living here in Sacramento. She contacted me and said, you may not remember me, but I think you did. You smuggled me into America.
Oh, the chills, I forgot.
And I did a piece for the New York Times on that. She was in school, and she was becoming a graphics artist. And I've lost touch with her. I should ping her.
Yes.
But we had this wonderful reunion, and it was so sweet. But that incident did it for me with him. And I was on the outs after that. I was involved in the union we got to talk about. I was a guild member and a strike, and he hated the guild. And
well, McClatchy hired the most expensive lawyers in America, union busting, not just newspapers, but big on union busting in America after not the printers.
It was
they went out and strike.
78, the strike in 78.
It was 78. And
they were still picketing when I was hired, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
It was very, very ill-informed in some ways. That strike, CK was hurt personally because they were such a family paper. There was a lot of paternalism. Like your first day there, they gave you a free meal in the cafeteria. It was that kind, and he felt, I've loved you. And how could you do this to me? And he went after it big time. So of course Gregory hated him because Gregory Favre, the executive editor, because that was CK's marching orders. The Bee went public what year? Do we remember? I'm sorry.
We're old enough now to forget that date.
It went public a few years. I left in '89. It went public a few years before. That was a very big moment in a change. What Dale meant, what you mentioned, was exactly it. This management by objective. It reminds me of the change in healthcare from where everyone had pretty good healthcare if their employers bought it, and it went to what we call mangled healthcare or managed healthcare, and everything changed. It was very similar. All of a sudden, it was a bureaucracy beyond, and we would have these one-year reviews. It was kind of like today where you get clicks on an internet if you wanted to investigate, if you got the scoop of the century. And it was very heavy. It was like the New York Times covering Trump. I don't think I have to say Donald Trump. And taxes, it went on forever, and people didn't want to read the whole thing. And you didn't get enough clicks. And so you wouldn't, maybe you'd be fired. If you don't get enough clicks today. It was like that. And we had the assistant city editor. And remember Steve Dressler?
Yes.
If you went anywhere on assignment, if you were near a bus station or any sleazy kind of area of a town, of any city, anywhere, you had to bring back a snowball. One of these cheesy, fabulous things with the name of the city, and you shake it and it snows. And he had a collection that, and if he knew you went away and didn't get it, he'd just bring you.
He was wounded, yes.
He was wounded. So, bottom line, little by little, it was cinematic. The sign of a sane journalistic mind is a very sloppy desk with files up to the ceiling and maybe a meal from last week. Well, I didn't do that, but others did. But and all kinds of paraphernalia and dirty jokes on your cubicle wall. And everything was very like your little space. You had these cubicles after we got from electric typewriters to VDTs. And all of a sudden, we got these memos where it had to look like a bank. And Steve had to get rid of his snowball collection, and we had to have neat desks, which, we didn't even know what that meant. That is superficial, but it really reflected what happened.
Yeah, and they hired an editor named Mike Flanagan, who, bless him, he was brought in as a tough guy. He was supposed to enforce this management by objective stuff, and it wasn't in him. He was just a good guy, and I got to know Mike really well, and he confessed all this to me. And the last 2 years I was there, he said, Dale, Gregory Favre hasn't looked at me he sees me in the hall, he looks away. And he was making his life hell. And anyway, Mike Flanagan committed suicide a few years later. And I'm not going to blame the Bee for his suicide, but it was a factor, like many suicides. It's a mosaic of things, and the Bee was one thing. And just, when I left the paper, I ended up in New York City in 1991. And Mary Crystal Cage, another reporter, great reporter. I hope Chris Cage is doing great. We were on top of a roof up near the George Washington Bridge. So from there you can see all of Manhattan. It was 2 days before 9/11. It was not 91. It was 2001. I'm in New York, and we're standing on top of the roof, and we're looking at the towers, and we're talking about the Bee for 2.5 hours as the sun went down and it got dark. And we were talking. You can't tell anybody who wasn't in there the mind PTSD. We were like, it was like people wouldn't even come near us. We were just like going like this. So I'm going to go to the end of my time at the Bee. It was done. I got hired at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. It was the Gulf War, first Gulf War. I covered a protest down at the Capitol. I filed my story. I came back at 1 or 2 in the morning. I cleaned my desk out, and the night guard was there, and
the night guard. Well, that's his name.
it wasn't Bernie, but it was another guy.
I was thinking Bernie.
And I put a Preston Sturges quote on my cubicle, very clean cubicle with nothing on it. I put it on my back wall. Preston Sturges essentially said when he left Paramount Studios, no man of value could do it anymore. Before he were a man of value, he wouldn't be a man of value if he did it. And I sent a system-wide message to the entire building, which I wasn't supposed to know how to do, but the guys in the tech department told me how. I said, it's been nice working with some of you. And I wheeled my shit out and said goodbye to the guard. The guard thought I was joking, and I'm quitting. And I left, and I never looked back. The No Cake Club, Rick Abrams and the No Cake Club,
and God knows that Gregory Favre, who was executive editor, would have loved to have been able to brag that I made Dale Maharidge because I gave him and Williamson their chance and supported them, and he did in many ways.
In many ways, he did. I'll give him that. He would
love to be able to get credit. I wanted to say that when Gregory came, we didn't do our homework. We were so hungry to do big things. We were so hungry to have. He found the key to the McClatchy Golden Vault to be able to support reporters with really big stuff. He came from the Chicago Sun-Times. We were impressed. We didn't look into any stories about him. We didn't call reporters there, and he was going to be our new boss. We knew the big stuff they were able to do. We knew Chicago. We were in love with Mike Royko. We were in love with journalism, Chicago's rough and tumble journalism. And we thought, this is it. We have really hit the jackpot. And in many ways we did. But we didn't do our homework. So and I can say I didn't do my homework, and I just fell in love with him. I was so thrilled to have somebody so gonzo for real journalism. And I must say, I'm one of the people, more than 1 year, I was one of his stars for a number of years. And as part of that, and you were part of, we would even on a weekend, because his wife was getting her PhD in Chicago.
We socialized.
We socialized.
I made dinners at my house, dinners at your house.
He always had his flourless chocolate cake. Yeah. And we would cook together, and we'd drink together, and we'd tell war stories. They might as well have been in the old bars that we used to hang out at the Torch Club at the Union. Anyway, and so we were like an extended family. I must say, we were on such a trajectory that we really didn't think a lot. I didn't think a lot that everybody didn't have the status we had to be able to come up with an idea, go to the city editor, if the city editor backed it and the project's editor, Gregory would hear about it, and we'd go in and just shoot the breeze with Gregory about it, and it was phenomenal. We didn't think about all the people who didn't have that.
Right.
When people we wrote about who were in power didn't like what we wrote and came into Mama Gregory, we would be invited into that meeting as the writer, as the staff writer. Other people, if people they wrote about didn't like it, they weren't invited in. Mm-hmm. The honchos of Sacramento would meet with Gregory, and they never even know.
Yeah. So
I lived there long enough to experience both worlds, as a star and as an object of punishment. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's very much the it was the best of times and worst of times. I got 3 books out of the Bee. One of them won a Pulitzer Prize.
Nieman. You're not mentioning.
I had a Nieman fellowship.
After which you returned, and they.
Well, I got shit on when I got back. That's another. I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
But it was a mixed bag, and Gregory was not alone. In his defense, it was a culture of it was a corporation at that point. It wasn't family anymore. So he was just part of that.
I think he was the leader, though.
Well, but it wasn't, he didn't come in and, it wasn't him single-handedly, I'm saying. He was brought in. Okay. It was this whole, so it was part of a bigger thing than him. So my feelings towards the newspaper are bigger than that in terms of, but I love the institution. It was an amazing 11 years of my life, but it was bittersweet at the end.
Yes. Well, let me just say, many newspapers nationally, you know this, a lot of the people in a lot of places the Guild was their life, the newspaper Guild. And a lot of the people for whom the Guild was their life, many of them, whom I knew anyway, complained a lot. They were people who, they were competent journalists who wanted to improve their papers and the negotiations and the compensation and benefits and everything, but could also complain a lot. And frankly, I always supported the Guild. I went out, we had informational picket lines. I met our dog on that line. But anyway, and we were always supportive. Bob Forsyth, who was city editor, became president of the Sacramento Newspaper Guild. And ironically, was president of the press club. And I followed him. I was vice president of the press club. And then he asked me to be his vice president of the Guild. That was the first time I ever got very active in the Guild, in the sense that I really didn't want to take away from work.
Remember the march in Fresno? We went to Fresno, and Cesar Chavez supported us.
God damn.
Oh my gosh. So here we are marching. There's only about 11 people from the Bee went down. Not many of us came down there. And there's Cesar Chavez marching with us. I'll never forget that.
Love you for remembering that. I would have forgotten.
What a guy he was.
I would have forgotten
Oh my
that.
gosh.
Well, here's what happened, having never been active in the Guild and being a crusader, and the old-fashioned social justice person, and afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted journalism person. I was friendly with a guy named Lee Fremstead, who was about 10 years older than I, had been at the Bee 30 years at least, maybe 31, 32. He was a delicious writer. He had in those days they allowed him to freelance. He freelanced for Esquire magazine in his time. When we were there, we weren't allowed to write for anybody else. He was a real writer and reporter. And when he started the Bee, I didn't know that at the time, but he started in the Courts Beat, where you stand a lot at counters with files for hours and hours. Okay. Lee became ill, and it was his stomach, and he became very ill. He was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, had all the sick leave he needed. He had worked at the Capitol for many years on the political beat, and like most white men in particular, he had a lot of hubris, and he didn't want to beg for anything. And it was clear that Lee should be best used. If I'd been editor, I would have put him in a corner of the newsroom and said, write whatever you want. Don't make him a columnist, because that would put a lot of pressure, but he would find fabulous stories and they'd be written first class. And so he had a history of a competition in bad blood with the city, not the city editor, the city editor, George Baker.
Oh, yes.
They were not friends from the Capitol Bureau. All of a sudden, George was brought over as city editor to the newsroom from being head of the Capitol Bureau. And one of the reasons Lee left the Capitol Bureau was to get away from their, butting heads. Thus began, and we're using the words the way we used it in the newsroom, the mind or the punishment syndrome that is used in industry everywhere. You make somebody so unhappy, they're going to leave.
Yeah.
And so Lee was put on the court beat. Now, how do you take a guy who's, 6 foot something, and had a great career and cut him down and deball him? How do you do that, You put him back in the first beat he ever did, and you tell him, this is who you are now. I got the chills. Well, I went in to Gregory Favre, who was my friend, my patron, and I fought for him, for Lee. And I sat down, I told him what was going on. Lee was back in the hospital, and I said, and I was speaking to Lee's wife on the phone every night without Lee knowing, because I wanted to be accurate about his health. And I went and I fought for Lee. And Gregory said, okay. And he said to me, Gregory was a Southern paternalist, and he was an authoritarian. It was his way or the highway. And I'd always been on his highway. And he said, I don't like people who need other people to fight for them. If he's a man, he'll come in here and fight for himself. And I said, he's very sick. And he has a lot of pride, call it hubris, whatever. He's not going to come in here and get on his knees to you. He's not going to beg. I'm with the Guild. You may not love the Guild, but we all respect the hell out of Lee Famstead, and we don't want to see him die on the job or something. Well, anyway, I found out much later on that it went months. Gregory did not speak to Lee. He did not change his assignments on the court beat. Lee went into the hospital, and Lee died. And I went nuts. I just went crazy. And I, up till then, held the confidence of what Gregory told me. I learned afterwards in a yelling, Gregory screaming at me. I didn't open my mouth because when he yelled, it was big. And he told me that he took Lee out to lunch. But guess what? He took George Baker with him.
Oh, gosh.
So it's like, I said, what did you do? Talk politics? I mean, what did you talk about the weather? I mean, that is not the kind of meeting I thought he was going to have with Lee. And so when Lee died, I went around the newsroom and I told everybody that because people were crying. I mean, people were very upset. Many people had worked with Lee many, many years. Others just knew him on a more recent basis, but most people really respected and knew what he had done at that paper. I told them that I'd gone in and fought, that I wanted them to know that their guild had tried to get Lee the right job, the humane thing to do. Well, Gregory heard I did it. He called me in, and he read me the riot act, and he said, he was screaming, red in the face, this is my newsroom. And I managed to get out, this is my newsroom too, and it's their newsroom too. I was, as I said, doing cover stories for the Sunday magazine, and one of them I got into a Carmelite nunnery where nobody ever has walked but Carmelite nuns, and that went over big. The next one, I was in the governor's office, Duke Majan, and I saw a picture on the desk of his assistant, his deputy. And it was a gorgeous woman who looked like a guruette, I called her. And I said, who is that? And they said, the person said, that's the head of City Yoga. So what is that? Oh, it's the biggest movement. Hollywood stars are naming their kids after her. It's very high-heeled. It's very, really successful. Famous people are in it. I said, I never heard of it. And her name was Gurumai Chid Vilasananda. You can imagine how long it took me to learn to say it, and I amazingly still remember. Thus began more than a month investigation from India through everywhere. This group, to me, it was very similar to Scientology. Except it didn't exactly steal money from poor people who joined. These were mostly well-heeled people. The board of directors included a vice president from Kidder Peabody. There were folks from, the Wall Street folks from New York, very well-heeled. They had an ashram in Berkeley, or was it on the Oakland border? Pink. Anyway, I managed on a weekend to go there. She was coming to town, and I decided I was going to get an interview. And of course, nobody had ever interviewed her. I didn't know the whole story then, but the bottom line is, no article really appeared investigatively of this organization because they had lawyers who would, like Scientology, they had the bucks to sue and big, deep pockets. And editors would get scared off. And they'd say, who the hell cares about a cult enough to have to do this? I mean, if they were taking poor people and if they owned a house, getting their deed to the house and all that, maybe. But who cares, right? So I wrote a cover story about it. It was lawyered to death. Gregory Favre did not know I was writing the story because this wasn't his kind of story. It wasn't political. It wasn't social. It was a fringy thing, and I loved the underbelly. That's what I went for everything. And but Terry Dvorak, the editor of the magazine, was very seriously into it with me. It was lawyered to death by Gary Pruitt, the Bee's lawyer, who became...
Who's now the president of Associated Press.
And he was the head of McClatchy.
Right.
When they bought 12 papers and then started to go bankrupt, but that's another story. Gary was fantastic. We lawyered it and lawyered it and lawyered it. It was ready to go. And it sat in the computers of the magazine for many, many weeks. I think when it hit about 6 weeks, I was chomping at the bit to get this out because I knew, particularly in LA, how big this was. Soon they would buy the entire Borscht Belt of upstate New York and had very big plans to make the old singles hotels, Grossingers and everything into a huge cult center. I'm calling it that. And I just wanted to get this out before. I couldn't believe that nobody was writing a big take out on it. I couldn't believe it. It never saw the light of day. I was told by an editor on the desk that did features and magazines that I had a problem, that it was put into some kind of stasis where it would probably never see the light of day. I went in and spoke to my very close friend and editor over the editor of the magazine at Canale, who told me, I can't lose my job fighting for you. And I said, I wouldn't expect you to lose your job. But it was clear that I was then going to be punished. After more weeks, I don't know if it was over 2 months, I decided, by then I was given an assignment to do a feature on an electronic address book and calendar. Today we have them, but this was before they existed. And Ralph Ventura, the features editor, tried to tell me how exciting a story this was. Really? Okay. I saw the writing on the wall, and I decided, per the quote that you left, that I was going to do the quietest thing I have ever done. And I am not known to be quiet, as I'm proving, that I was going to walk out with a 3-sentence, I hadn't done it yet. I was going to walk out. I needed eye surgery, big eye surgery in San Francisco. I was going to take all the sick leave I could get, look for work. And I did that. When I got my next job, I wrote a 3-sentence resignation letter, so to speak, and Ralph called me hysterical. I don't believe this. You can't do this. What we have to make you happy. What happened? Or whatever. And by then, I forgot. I had asked Canale to ask Favre. I wasn't speaking to Favre, and he wasn't speaking to me. I wanted permission before I resigned to take my article, and I had taken photographs. I did get the interview with her, the only one anyone ever got in the history of City Yoga, from India across Europe here. And it was just magic. I don't know how it happened. I got permission to take it. Once I got permission, that's when I wrote the 3. 2 years later, I was in Marin County writing an investigative publication for a very ahead of its time public health think tank for the legal drugs, I got a call from Liz Harris of The New Yorker, who had been looking for me for 2 years. And Liz Harris wrote this story, which is it's this whole magazine. It was known, Tina Brown called it the most controversial article in the history of The New Yorker.
Tina Brown being the editor of New Yorker.
Editor of New Yorker, formerly of Vanity Fair, British, very famous. This was November 14, 1994. I was going through 8 surgeries in 5 years anyway, on my right eye thing, and lost the sight of my right eye ultimately. So I knew I could not, I wished I could have done it, but I gave her all my notes, my tapes. I gave her everything I had. And essentially, in a Sunday magazine newspaper, much shorter article, covered the same basis. She did a fabulous job, but I just thought, I don't know if you ever saw it, actually. Did I send you a copy?
I think you may have sent me a copy. Yeah. But anyway, that's
it.
The Ark of the Bee. It was an amazing place. It wasn't a perfect place. I'm glad I was there, and I'm glad I left.
Ditto. I'm not going to say versus the Washington Times because.
By the way.
Oh, he's what?
It's still recording.
Are you kidding?